All right, so I'm glad you guys started chatting again after my mild chiding at 9:27, but it's 9:31 now, so your chatter can only be about IT test controls testing now. So that's what you're limited to. If you chat about anything else, then I have to count points off. I'm just kidding. All right, today we're going to be talking about IT controls testing. This is an interesting series of cases. So this is something I struggled with when I first started developing this assignment. I think it was like the assignment I created. I created these kind of separate assignments 4 years ago, and then I kind of merged them together after the fact. The problem with these assignments is that this is in case you ever become an instructor of accounting. What you're going to find is that you have some ideas for what it is you want to teach, but trying to find a framework for how you teach it becomes really challenging. And this is a kind of example of cases in two extremes. I really like the detail in the breach at TGX case. It is an old case. It's I guess 14 years old now, and it deals with the breach that's almost 20 years old. There are still some very relevant lessons we can learn, as we're going to talk about today. That being said, I am not a big advocate for how they kind of did the debrief. So the whole goal of a teaching case is that you give an assignment on something that students are it's important for students to learn, and then you have some mechanism for helping reinforce that information. And I felt like this is kind of a phone-in activity. And if Sandra Sariola and Ronald Sariola ever see my video, they're going to say, "How dare you?" But the end of the case where they said, "All right, here are the frameworks. Here's each component of the framework. Provide every single piece of information you know about every single component." That's just lazy writing, in my opinion. So I did really want to talk about this case, and I did really want to talk about some things related to the frameworks, but you'll notice I said you only have to put one item for each component. And the idea is I want you to do some work, but I think that work for the sake of work is kind of pointless. So I did think that this was a very interesting case, and it was very dynamic, and there's a lot of detail, a lot of depth we can go into. And then we have the actual Excel assignments that was kind of at the end, which we're going to kind of wrap up with because it's pretty easy. That's on the far end. I think they kind of dumbed that one down a little bit too much. I think that their audience was probably something a little bit lower than this particular point in graduate studies. I think it's effective to learn about how the process for testing IT controls works, because it's not actually that much different. This is an example of certain IT controls we want to test. That being said, this should not have been a very difficult assignment for you. I think everybody probably jumped into that. It says this is like well beyond my Excel skills, well beyond this assignment. And if you weren't in that category, I'm sorry, I'm making assumptions, but that was kind of the idea. So very first thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the case. Now, I do want to reiterate this point because this comes up a lot. And this is something that there's some humorous anecdotes in the past. When I assign you a case, obviously I expect you to read the case and to have knowledge of what the contents of the case are. It's not just, okay, let's go back immediately to questions, then we'll look up the detail. There's relevant information throughout the case. So let's go ahead and debrief on some of the important points of the case. This is actually about a company called TJX. Now, by show of hands, how many people had heard of TJX? Not the brands that TJX had, but had heard of TJX before reading this case? Okay, so when you started reading it, you probably read about the brands, and you're like, "Oh, I recognize the brands. I recognize the names." The ones that came up to me, I think they had a list of the companies that was at TJX, but the ones that I picked up on were TJ Maxx and Marshalls were the two that really jumped out to me. And that's only because my sister-in-law is a very thrifty individual. She does almost all of her fashion shopping and craft shopping at TJ Maxx and Marshalls. And I've accompanied her on a few occasions because basically I am terrible with fashion. And she'll say, "Okay, you really need new clothes." And I'm like, "Oh, is that bad?" It's like, "Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad." So but yeah, that's how I know about TJ Maxx and Marshalls. And how would we characterize those two companies? Is anybody familiar with those two stores? They actually allude to it in the case, but this is kind of true for all of their merchandising brands. How would we characterize them? They're retail, but is that a sufficient description? Retail clothing, is that a sufficient description? What word would be really, really important to actually throw on there? Retail clothing store. I'm going to keep adding words until somebody comes up with the word that I'm looking for. What adjective would you use to describe the nature of their business? Are they like Neiman Marcus and Saks Fifth Avenue? Is that the category? Is that their competitor line? What's a big difference between Neiman Marcus and TJ Maxx? Cost. Okay, so Neiman Marcus, we'd say are upper end. That's the people who have way too much money to spend. It's just kind of like saying, I want something nice. I'm going to go shopping. Okay. TJ Maxx is like, I'm very, very frugal, thrifty, or thrifty. I want something nice, but I don't want to spend a lot of money for it. Okay. So what's that? Discount. Yeah, discount's a good way to describe that. Yeah. Okay. And by the way, I will say that I have shopped at Marshall's very recently. I bought a gift card for one of the admins here at Truman State, and I found out that the Marshalls here in Kirksville has dark chocolate covered pecans. Okay, which I am afraid to go back because they were very, very delicious, and So if anybody wants to get my good side, there's a good way to do it. Actually, get on my good side and then on my bad side, because I will be very angry for you for tormenting me. But anyway, that's not really the point of the case. That was just an interesting side note that I did shop at Marshall's recently, and so I found that out. So how would we characterize? This is not going to be the details related to the controls frameworks that we're going to talk about here in just a second. But how would we characterize TJ Maxx's or TJX's culture? How would you characterize that? It talks about it in the case. Dysfunctional, functional, somewhere in between. It's probably I think everybody's thinking right now, what is a good thing that Dr. Barnes will accept? Oh, I know. It depends. Yeah. Everybody's just gonna answer it depends. Okay. And I that's probably a correct answer, as it is in most situations in accounting. But a little bit more objectively, how will we characterize the culture at TJX? I think it's pretty strong culture. It actually says on the second page of the case, 522, centers on management and staff acting with integrity. It emphasizes that all people must be treated with dignity, respect, and caring. Now, that is easy to say, but it's also a challenge to actually put in action. So, with respect to the culture, do we think that the case kind of illustrates that particular emphasis, that emphasis on caring, culture, enthusiasm? Now, again, this is a case about internal controls testing, internal controls violations, and data breaches. Is it possible that you can have a good overall environment and organization and still have bad controls? Yes. Okay. And we're going to get into that because there's some interesting notes to there. All right. So it talks a little bit about information technology at the bottom of the second page of the case, and going into the third page, it says success therefore depends on TJX's ability to have information systems that permit them to maintain a flexible business model, engage in opportunistic purchasing, and maintain efficient inventory management system, and maintain low-cost operations. What is the common theme throughout there that was being said there? They're very, very focused on cost and profitability, as a good organization should be. Is it a particular emphasis for this organization? They're a low-cost provider, so cost is kind of be their starting point, and then everything else has to play around that. So if they have an information system that provides a massive benefit, but it's just going to be too expensive to implement, they may say, we can't really justify that based on the benefits perceived. The costs are just too high. And is that relevant to accounting decisions? I can't believe I have to ask this question again. Okay. Wake up, guys. Wake up. Okay. Is the concept of cost versus benefit relevant to accounting decisions? Okay, I should have heard an enthusiastic yes from every single person. If you're not paying attention to what I say right now, I'm going to throw something at you. I just saw like 3 people who didn't even flinch when I raised my voice there. That's amazing. That's amazing. It's like, oh, Dr. Barnes is just blowing smoke again, blowing steam. I was, okay. All right. So yes, we can say that the cost versus benefit consideration is a big one, and this is going to be something that kind of affects this case in particular here. So what happened on December 18th, 2006? There was a discovery of an unauthorized intrusion in their computer systems that process and store information related to customer transactions. So there was a data breach. At least they detected a data breach. Did the data breach occur on December 18th, 2006? No, it occurred for many, many months previous to that. What period of time? 18 months. Yeah, it was like an 18-month period. Yeah, so going on for a long period of time. All right. It was determined that personal confidential customer information was stolen. The scope of this breach spanned 18 months, approximately 18 months. Now, if you do a little bit digging on this, you can find out about the detail of the breach. It does allude a little bit to it, but there's some information online. Anybody want to guess about how many customers were affected by this data breach? Or does anybody know, I guess? 45.7 million customers. 45.7 million customers. Approximately 94 million credit cards were affected. Okay. So, yeah, pretty massive breach. Now, keep in mind, this was 2006 when this was an activity was not prevalent. Nowadays, we just kind of like, well, that's just cybersecurity, Dr. Barnes. That happens every other day, you know. In fact, it's funny because I actually got a in the mail, I got a postcard, and it was part of a class action suit about a data breach for a an organization that I didn't even realize I was a part of. And they said, your information may have been compromised. How do you want your settlement payment made? And it's like, well, okay, that's where we're at right now. We're just spamming class action lawsuits and just basically sending out postcards to the people who could be recipients for that, which I guess is efficient because I just had to fill out the postcard and put it in the mail, which if they were just data mining for my information, that was a very, very efficient way to actually, I haven't filled out the postcard yet. So I shouldn't say stuff like that. But it's kind of interesting that we're reached a point now that data breaches have become so commonplace that we just kind of we're just kind of desensitized to them. So this is one where data breach was kind of not really common, and it was kind of a clarion call for something that should have happened. Should have been one of those things like saying, "Oh wow, this is what the future looks like. We should probably take a step forward." And we're going to talk a little bit about that. What was the result of this? All right, so data breach occurred in one of two ways. What was the first method that the data breach occurred, or the access to the network took place? So it says in the case that they used directional antennas in a laptop computer. The perpetrators intercepted electronic transmissions over TJX's wireless network. So they were outside TJX's headquarters, and basically there's a wireless network conveying information, and they just jumped on the wireless network, which that's pretty common nowadays. You pull out your phone and you're just kind of like, okay, what networks are available? Okay, I can get on this one, and you can just leech off the internet. They were doing a little bit more than leeching off the internet. They were just like saying, all right, is there any information that we can pull? Oh yeah, all this information is not effectively encrypted, so we can just pull all this detail. We can just pull all the information that we need. It talked a little bit about the encryption protocols that were in place at the time. Now, again, this was almost 20 years ago. This is 2006. And the snarky remark that always comes into mind is like, that was over 20 years, Dr. Barnes. Did the internet even exist back then? I'm like, yes, okay. It's really scary to me that I'm talking to people who have not had any experience in life without internet. The internet has existed your entire lifetime. Because I remember when it was still dial-up, having to get on the internet, and it was back in the 90s when you had to take your telephone and you had to attach it to the modem and to connect. And sometimes, like previous to that, you didn't even have separate phone lines, so you either had to have a telephone, a landline that you wanted to make a call. There was no mobile phones. Man, I really feel old right now. I really feel old. So yeah, 2006 we did have that, and so they said that there were protocols for encryption, but they were really kind of in their infancy. So what was the protocol that was talked about in the case that TGX is using? It's called Wired Equivalency Privacy. Wired Equivalency Privacy, WEP. Was that a sufficient protocol to be following at that time period? It is not sufficient at the time. It was basically gave the equivalent of being like a direct wired connection, a hardwired connection, which is not that much different than being wireless. There's not really significant difference. So there's a little bit of a kind of a debrief about what's going on with that. So I kind of here's a wireless security cheat sheet that I looked up online. So this is basically saying this is not usable, WP. One thing they were talking about in the case is they should have been using WPA, Wi-Fi protected access, which basically encrypts the information that's over the wireless connection. Now, note, this was 20 years ago. This is no longer a valid protocol, okay? It doesn't have sufficient keys, all right? Now we're up to WPA2, PA2 and WPA3. So 20 years later, we have much stronger encryption methods. By the way, the idea of encryption will resonate again when we talk about our cybersecurity case study. I think that's in week 9, is that we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to reflect back on this, and they're going to have some lessons that we're going to learn from this. But for the most part, we can say, yeah, their wireless system was not up to par even for 2006. We think, okay, we cut them a break because it was 2006. Dr. Barnes says, yeah, there had to be some security and some protocols in place, and they were just very, very far beyond that. Okay, and then what was the other point of breach that's talked about in the case? Something that doesn't really exist nowadays, but was really common back in the 1990s and 2000s, which I know it's not fair because, you know, while everybody in this room was technically alive in the 2000s, you probably weren't thinking about security protocols back in the early 2000s. It's like, yeah, got out of the womb, and you're just kind of like, okay, there's a cybersecurity breach right there in this operating room. Yeah, no. So it talks about the customer service kiosks. Is anybody familiar with the concept of the customer service kiosks in the retail stores? So a little bit of background what they mean by that. Now, again, this is a generational thing. Back in the 70s and 80s, when people wanted to apply for jobs or they wanted to have customer service, they would actually go to a customer service. And I think they still have the customer service booths in most retail stores, but that was the only point of contact. It's like, okay, I would like to apply for a job here, or I'd like to put something on layaway, whatever it is, customer service connection. In the 1990s and 2000s, they got clever and said, hey, we've got computers. We could just set up a computer where a lot of people can do these things. This was particularly prominent for people who wanted to apply for jobs. They would just come sit in the store. They would sit down on the computer. They would type out an application, and the application would be directly filed. And that was what they were referring to. They actually said in-store computer kiosks that used to capture job seeker information. Okay, so that was a point of connection, and it was a very valuable point of connection because basically that was an easy way for people to put in applications without having to take the time up of people who are doing customer service. What do we do nowadays, by the way? Why are the customer service kiosks kind of antiquated now? We have this thing that begins with the letter I. It's really, really popular. Okay. Also called the information superhighway. What is that thing called the information superhighway? Yes, like, I know it is, Dr. Barnes. We're not going to talk. Okay. You're the one talking. So I'm going to make you say it. The internet. There we're talking about the internet. Yes. Okay. They can actually capture a lot more information much more effectively and conveniently. So we can actually just do online applications or online layaway or online transactions. So it's much more effective in that regard. So generational change has kind of made that obsolete. But it's important to note that this was a very, very effective system for capturing information within the stores. And it actually was helpful because it didn't take up employee time to be able to capture that information. That being said, so we know that the information was captured through wireless antennas for the first one. How was the information captured in the second one? What was the point of entry that they used at these computer terminals? So they were super hackers, like in those TV shows, okay? And they were just like, okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and type in a whole bunch of lines of code in like 20 seconds. And does anybody ever watch like there was an old movie called Swordfish. It's like 20 years old, had Hugh Jackman in it, and he's like a computer hacker, and he's just literally just going like this, just random on the keyboard, and this keyboard or the screen just fills with code, and it's perfectly parsed. It's not like it's perfectly ordered and systematic. I'm like, okay, this is like the biggest disconnect from reality that I think is in the entire movie. The whole movie is absurd, but that's the biggest disconnect from entire reality. So was it hackers? Well, yes, it was hackers, but is that what they were doing? They were going to the keyboard and typing in malicious code? No, what were they doing? Where did they connect through? Yeah, USB drives. Okay, USB drives, which yeah, you think that's a relatively modern concept, and it is somewhat modern if you can consider in the context. But they would just basically upload the code into the system just using the USB drive. So they're unprotected USB ports. Now, quick question, okay? Quick question. Can you disable USB ports on a computer? Yeah, I had a few people. So Tyler was very, very emphatic. Yes, you absolutely can. Okay. Clayton thought about it for a second and said, yes, you can. You're both right. Okay. You're both right. And I kudos to you guys, by the way, for being emphatic on that answer. Because I asked this question last year and everybody's kind of like, I don't know, Dr. Barnes. It's like, what are you using Google for if you're not increasing your information base? Yes, you can actually Google that and find out, can I disable USB ports? The answer is yes. At the very least, could they have just capped off the USB ports so people can't access them without product or privilege? Could they have just put a USB lock on top of it? Those exist as well, okay? So if they wanted to keep the USB ports live but didn't want people to have access to them. So that would be a very simple solution that would have prevented that access. But we've got 2 points of access, which are certainly problematic. And that kind of leads into our story. So yeah, they ended up having a complaint associated with TJX that they failed to follow some basic practices, which I think was the case. And our goal today is to actually determine, based on the evidence, how TJX succeeded or failed in many cases, based on the COSO framework and the COBIT standards. So I allude to this in the instructions. These are older versions of both COSO framework and the COBIT framework. The COSO framework has not effectively changed, though. The one was used in place, in this case, was to COSO 1992. They made some updates to it in 2013, but none of the components have actually changed. So it's exactly the same 5 components. The COBIT framework has changed. There's actually a newer component to it. I think we had to do 4 for this case, and there's 5 now. The interesting thing is that the 5th one is basically the same as the first one, but it's just basically a reiteration. So they think about it at the beginning before they've expanded upon it, the review, and then they review it again at the end. So it's just kind of a reflection point. So I don't think it's necessary to revise this. All right, so here we go. Let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about each of these. So let's start with COSO, and I think COSO is kind of the low-hanging fruit. Now, I'm going to approach this from COSO in a couple different ways, okay? I'm going to approach it in general, and then we're going to talk specifically about the IT environment, because keep in mind, this is an IT governance case, an IT controls case, but we can actually have a company that takes control seriously and just had failed in a particular aspect. So we want to talk about what was the general approach that they had with respect to both overall controls and controls with respect to information technology. Now, we may not do that for every step, but we're definitely going to do that for control environment. So before I call out the groups, I wanted to ask the class as a whole, how would we characterize the control environment in general, just the control environment at TJX? Again, I'm not asking specifically about IT governance, but I'm asking about controls in general. Do we think that they I'm not even say did a reasonable job, but they tried to do a reasonable job with respect to controls at the company? I would say that they probably tried to do a thorough job there. The case, it doesn't say that this was a sloppy company that did not care about controls. They did take this seriously. They allude to that at the very beginning. That was one of the phrases I read to you, is that they said that they talked about making sure that the culture and management staff to act with integrity, emphasize that people must be treated with respect and caring. And so that doesn't really allude to the controls itself, but it illustrates the idea that they're taking the whole process seriously, that management does have emphasis on doing things the right way. Now, is it possible that we could have a failure in control environment in one area while still maintaining a strong control environment as a whole? Certainly. Okay. So let's talk specifically about the control environment with respect to information technology controls. Okay. So are there areas that we could actually improve upon? Are there areas that we could identify that there were strong? Yes. Okay. So let's see what you guys wrote down here. So with respect to control environment, again, what I had you identify was the control issue and whether it was a strength or weakness, and you had to put risk assessment and a type of risk. We're not going to go into full detail. I would like you to tell me the control issue that your group identified and tell me whether you think your group identified as a strength or weakness. I expect most of these to be weaknesses because those are a little bit easier to identify, but some of you may have identified strengths in certain areas. So we'll start off with the first group. Mary, with control environment, what'd your group identify? For control environment. And if you just use the one in the case, if you want to say that's the one we used, that's what I'm going to say. Okay, that's just working smarter, not harder. What does it say for the one in the case? It says they have a board of directors and information technology, or does not have board of directors and information technology committee. So they do have a strong control environment, but it doesn't look like they have people that are specifically assigned to address controls over information technology. Okay, so certainly problematic areas, especially as we see that a burgeoning area. Should this have been kind of something that would have been caution in 2006? Should they have been kind of on top of this? Like, so 2006, most organizations did have direct wired connections. I know nowadays it's pretty much a gun conclusion that you're not going to have a landline for telephone, that you're just going to have an internet connectivity. Like, how many people have internet connections at their domiciles, their place of living? I would assume most everybody. Okay, that's kind of a given now. That was not a given back then, but we're getting to the point that it was starting to become more prevalent, more prominent. I think 2002 was the first time that I actually had a place where I lived that actually had a direct internet connection that you get on at any time. So it was not too far after that. So is this something that information technology was becoming more increasingly prominent, and internet connectivity and wired connectivity and wireless connectivity were becoming more common? Absolutely. Should they have had more people in place for oversight of information technology? Certainly. Okay, so this was a pretty significant weakness, in my opinion, is that they identified it. They said it was a low risk, but I would say that it was only a low risk with the context of the fact that this was still a developing area. This had the potential to become something that it was going to be a much more significant risk. So I disagree with the assessment of being low, but I do think that this is an important assessment to make. All right, what about risk assessment? Andrew, what'd your group say? Okay, can you repeat that one more time? Okay, so they basically had not identified any risks that had been placed. Okay, so when something bad happened, they were like, okay, we don't know what to do. So that's effectively your assessment. So that's a pretty solid one. Okay, would you say that that's a strength or a weakness? A weakness. Okay, all right. Yeah, I had to clarify, but yeah. So they did not really have a plan in place if something went south. Okay, so we do have a concept for this. We do have concept for certain controls that are in place to create or to stop a problem from ever taking place, and then certain controls that when a problem does take place, that we identify it and then we fix it. Okay, what was the former category? Preventive. Okay, preventative. Okay, what's the latter categories? Detective and corrective. Yes. So having controls in both categories seems to be important. And it looks like that they were very, very focused on this idea of prevention. But if prevention was not effective, how do you fix the problem? And they were left scrambling after that. So good, good. All right. Control activities. Jake, what's your group say?
He said while they had payment authorizations and some form of personal info verification, they didn't have any access controls for like the in-store computers and kiosks. So there was not really like a user authorization process mentioned.
Yeah. So yeah, just anybody comes in and plops a USB drive in. It's probably not just as simple as that, but that's still just a problem. Is that if anybody can access the system, you want to make sure that only certain people have access to certain parts of the system. Now we've got some experience with this. Everybody remember back, I guess 1 or 2 years ago, depending how long it is. I harped on this a lot back when we did NetSuite. Okay, we did NetSuite and we went through the system in NetSuite. I said, we don't all have access to every area. We do for our example, but the whole goal is to actually separate out access so that people cannot access areas they're not authorized to be working in. This is going to be especially true for external entities because external entities can access internal information, and they can compromise that. And we're going to see a little bit of a danger of that when we get to the testing control. So certainly problematic in that area. I guess I should clarify that's a weakness. We're going to say right there, right? Is that what your group said? Or say, no, that's a strength, okay? Because that means more people can get the, okay, I apologize. I'm being facetious. I know that's hard to believe. All right. So information communication, McKenna, what'd your group say? Yeah, so they figured out the problem and they were pretty quick to respond. Okay, once they found the problem, the scope of the problem, they were to respond, and it didn't seem like they tried to hide it or they tried to shy away from it. All right, so how much detail do you think they put into it? How much detail they basically they disclosed it, they fixed the problem, they spent a lot of money to fix the problem. So quick question, do you think that this was mentioned in the 10K in 2006? How many people think that this computer intrusion was mentioned in the 10K? It was mentioned. They actually had an entire section on it. Okay, an entire section on it. So if you go to the 10K in 2006, talks about the computer intrusion they suffered, and they talked about the consequences of that. So they were very, very transparent with the effects of the computer intrusion, which is kind of refreshing. How transparent are they? What did we say? We're 18, 19 years in the future. How many people want to guess whether it was included in the 10K in 2024? It absolutely was included in the 10K in 2024. They actually talked about the computer breach from 2006. Okay. 18 years later, they're talking about it still. Goodness gracious. Goodness gracious. Isn't that amazing? Okay. So yeah, that's all bases covered. So I think that there's probably a really strong argument saying we're going to communicate this until we die. We're going to be reminded that we don't ever want this to happen again. All right. Now, interesting. So when we talk about information and communication, we talk about this for the purpose of stakeholders. Who do we think the stakeholders are in this scenario? Is it just going to be exclusively to the people inside the TJX? To the people who are working at TJX, to the customer, or sorry, not customers, to the employees, to the stake or stockholders? Is that it? Can we say that there's external stakeholders that might want to be updated? Yeah, for customers, sure. Regulatory authorities. Could we even argue that there may be stakeholders who are not intended stakeholders? Like other stores, other retail outlets could take this and say, oh my gosh, this is a warning. We got to fix this problem now, or otherwise it's going to be a recurring theme. All right, yeah, it should have been. Okay, now, based on the fact that we're going to talk about another data breach for a large retail organization here in a few weeks, do we think that companies did a very good job of being effective? No, okay, and we're going to talk about why that's the case here in just a little bit. We're going to talk about the nature of the benefits. But yeah, TGX took this very seriously, and the information communication was very transparent in that regard. So good identification. Okay. Last one. Monitoring. I sure hope it wasn't Jared that I had to call out because he just left the room, you know. Yeah, this is on a recording. I'm calling you out for leaving the room when we're getting to the nitty gritty, Jared. I'm going to ask a quiz question specifically on this question. I hope you identify it. I'm not. Okay, but don't tell Jared that. I'm recording this too. All right. All right. So what was our last one? Our last one was monitoring. Austin, what would your group identify on this one? Okay, so system identifying the intrusion, but they didn't really figure out what was going on. So what is monitoring again? Monitoring is seeing a problem and fixing the problem in response, and it seems like this is probably identifying as a weakness. Yes, so certainly a weakness there is that even though they did respond once they figured out the problem, figuring out the problem took a little bit more time than it probably should have. Okay, so overall, we can say from an IT perspective that we're not really happy with the COSO environment. So let's go ahead and break this down according to the COBIT framework. All right, so now we have the COBIT components. So there are 4 of these. And like I said, technically there's a 5th, but the 5th one has to do with planning and organizing again after the fact. We're going to ignore that, so we're just going to stick with these 4. All right, so had to do the same thing. Since we're going to be starting again with one that's already listed as the assessment risk, there's lack of control over information technology environments. We're going to skip this one and move on to acquire and implement. Okay. So acquire and implement, program development and change. How would we characterize that? Mary, what'd your group say? Right. So certainly problematic. I think we can say that that's both the case for both points of intrusion. They did not have the proper wired protocol in place and necessary. It was necessary. And then certainly there's going to be the USB access to the payment systems. I got both of those listed down. I'm going to back up real quick. Well, I'm back up here in just a second. But can we say that there are some potential strengths after the fact in this area? So did they investigate the accounting information system to figure out what the nature of the scope of problems are? Yeah, they did a very thorough job of that. They talk about that on 523. Also, did anybody catch the information about the data security fund? So they actually invested a large number of resources in trying to make sure there's proper data security moving forward. Okay, that included certification of the TJX computer systems. On plan and organize, okay, they did have improvements in data security following the breach, but we already talked about the lack of control of IT environment. Also, did they do a very good job of complying with FTC regulatory standards with respect to wired communication or wire information communication, technology communication? I knew I'd get there eventually. No, there were some problems with that. They talked about the nature of the regulatory standards on 525. And then they also talked about this thing called PCI standards. So what does PCI stand for? Personal computer individual, Dr. Barnes. Yes. Does everybody buy that? Personal computer individual? Nope, it's not. Payment card industry is what it stands for. Payment card industry. So if you're taking transactions using payment or credit cards or debit cards, do you think that you want to make sure that you've got strong controls in that area? Yeah, and there were some violations, though they didn't really specify what. My suspicion is that there were probably some encryption issues with respect to the payment cards. The only reason I mention this is because we're going to see, like I said, foreshadowing, this becomes a real problem with another company down the line. We're going to be talking about another retail company that had a major data breach, and they were not encrypting their credit card information at all. So that's certainly problematic as well. All right, delivery and support. So what do we have? I have here. Andrew, what'd you think?
Yeah, they did provide some.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. All good identifications of delivery that they did in response. So they definitely provide support. They also had that customer helpline they had put into place that was good identification. So yeah, a lot of good mechanisms are put in place when they were knew what the problem was. Jake, what did your group say? Hmm.
We kind of mentioned the same stuff about how once they dealt with the breach, they implemented the fund for future, like, they implemented the fund in reserve for future breaches. They took steps to pay recovery payments, and they instituted like a brand new data security monitoring program. So they kind of like, while they did mess up, it looks like they took the correct steps to prevent that.
Yep. And then, so yeah, there's some definitely some strengths in this area, and I think this is probably the strongest component or area of the COSO frame or COBIT framework we can identify. There are some definite weaknesses that we can identify. So, how long did this data breach go on? 18 months, yeah, a year and a half. That's certainly problematic, and it's like there's probably not a good support going on, not good delivery of mechanisms in place and governance if it's taking place. And as Austin alluded to, that there was a lack of immediate disclosure in this area. Now, why do we think that was the case? Is this something that it's definitely a weakness, but is it a justifiable weakness? Why would they want to? Why do they want to wait before they disclose this to the public? Well, probably because they want to know the entire scope of the problem. So if you go out and you say, okay, we got a data breach, everybody say, okay, what happened in the data breach? And people are going to say, well, we don't know the full scope of the data breach. What are people going to assume if you say you don't know the full scope of something? They're going to assume the world is ending. All right. The world is ending. You say people do not panic and they do not overreact. Has anybody been watching the stories about Philly's Karen lately? My gosh, okay. I mean, what she did was terrible, but come on, let's not wish death on people, okay? Yeah, people tend to overreact, okay? We're going to talk a little bit about that in more context in this course. But if you do not have complete information, you tend to fill in the blanks with information that's very extreme. Has anybody ever done that, by the way? Basically said, I don't know what the true answer is, so I'm just going to assume that the most likely answer is the most outrageous one. Every single person in this room has done that, whether you admit it or not. I've done it many, many times. Okay. It's just human nature to do that. All right. Part 4, monitor and evaluate. McKenna, what's your group say? Yeah, so certainly problematic with IT management oversight. Yeah, kind of the same thing we talk about delivery support. There's not really effective monitoring to address the risks. They're just kind of doing the same old, same old. Austin, what'd your group say? Yeah, so certainly that 18-month window is problematic, and that's really, really worrisome because there was a big window in which customer information could have been accessed or proprietary information could be accessed. So they did actually have some good after the fact stuff. They fixed the problem. They said that the electronic footprints, they actually tracked those to determine which files were copied. That was something they said after the fact. Now, the problem is that they failed to detect who the unauthorized users were. Now, is that a problem if you're trying to determine where the source of the breach came from, if you don't know who the unauthorized users were that accessed it? Yeah. And then probably the most really troubling one is that they knew that files were stolen. They did not know which files were stolen. That's really worrisome to me. It's like, okay, we've got this database and the nuclear codes are available in this database, but we don't know if those were stolen or not. Okay. Sorry about that, Mr. President. Yeah. Not knowing what the extent of the breaches, the nature of the breaches is certainly problematic. And it's just kind of the way that they intruded. They couldn't see which files were copied. So there was a little bit of disguise there. So that's certainly problematic in that regard. Overall, I think that we can kind of say this is an interesting lesson to take place. Again, it's a little bit antiquated and old, and I would not say that this would be a problem in most scenarios, but there are definitely some takeaways from this case. And one of the biggest takeaways that we're going to find is that when a problem occurs, that it should be something, a lesson for other organizations to learn from, and other stakeholders to learn from, and they don't really do that. Now, why do we think that's the case? So we're going to see multiple scenarios. We're going to talk about multiple data breaches where everybody should look at this case and said, "Oh, this is a problem. We got to fix this problem," and then they don't fix the problem. So if somebody who's an IT in an organization, you say, "Okay, it's 2006. TJX just suffered a massive data breach. We should fix this problem because we have the same vulnerabilities." And you go to your boss. What's your boss going to say? Are they going to say, "Well, you're absolutely right. Whatever money you need, we'll throw all kinds of cash at you"? Is that the way most bosses operate in big organizations? They're going to ask you a question. They're going to say, "Can you justify the cost?" Remember, we talked about that whole cost benefit thing, and I said we were coming back to it. Here we are. Here we are. What is the problem with preventative controls? They're very hard to quantify. They're very hard to quantify. You can quantify the costs very easily, but the benefits are much, much harder. It's like, okay, if we don't implement these controls, there's a chance that we could suffer a massive data breach and lose millions, if not billions of dollars. And then your boss is going to say, "What percentage chance?" And you say, "I don't know, 10%. Say, "I'm willing, that's fine. I'm willing to risk that." Okay. 10% is enough. It's like, you don't understand, it's 10% every single day. So eventually this will happen. And for many organizations, this did happen to varying extents. A lot of the policy for IT governance over the past 2 decades has been, we're going to wait and see if a problem takes place and then respond when a problem does occur. Is that an effective approach for any problem in life? It's like, I'm gonna wait and see if my van doesn't have any oil in it, but I'm gonna keep driving it until it does break down. And when it breaks down, then I'll fix it. Okay. Remember we talked about that back in auditing. That's not a good plan for things. Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna wait and see. I'm not gonna put gas in my vehicle. I'm gonna wait until it runs out of gas. Then I'll just go. I'll fill it in. I want to get every single last drop that I can and make sure it's absolutely empty. Does anybody do that in this room, by the way? Run their car until it's absolutely empty and then just kind of just walk over to the nearest convenience store or the nearest fuel station and get gas. Okay. Tell me if you do. I'm really curious how that plan works out for you. Okay. I'm really curious. All right. We got our tech control. So we're going to wrap this up real quick. Okay. So in this particular case, you had to go through a series of new and terminated employees, and you had to match them to system users. The idea being is that new employees had to be added to the system in the quarter they were added, and terminated employees had to be removed from the system. And you had to identify if there were any violations or any problems. So did anybody note any problems in here? Did your groups identify any problems, or was everything looking great? There were a few problems, okay? Now note, this is a really simplistic case because you were actually matching on names. Traditionally speaking, you would have a primary key that would be common between both databases, or a primary key in the hires database, and then one that you could match to the system usernames database. But they did it on names, which was certainly not precise. And you had to actually go through, I think this was just sound like a simple Excel activity. You had to actually merge these names together. You had to use a concat function, or if you use the ampersand function, kudos to you all for using shortcuts, okay? But you did have to merge the names together so you could match them to the system usernames. So let's just quickly go through these, okay? For the new hires was easy because there weren't a lot of problems. So for Q1, did you identify any problems? No. Q2, were there any problems? There was a small issue, a couple of issues for the same individual. So John Pence here, okay? First of all, John Pence apparently was hired in the year of 1014. Okay. I don't know how many people noticed that, but that's kind of one of those things like, how did that typo actually make it out? That should have been something, especially in an Excel spreadsheet where that's not even a valid date. That's just bizarre. Okay. But ignoring that, assuming that's a typo, what's the other problem with John Pence? John Pence is not in the system usernames, is not in the list of system usernames in a quarter two. Now is that an error? No. What's the explanation? He was also fired within a week of being hired. So you probably don't want to keep somebody in the system that has gotten fired. So Q3, new hires, any problems? I didn't see any. What about Q4? All right. So we're all good. Now let's go to the terminated employees. Any problems in Q1? All right. Any problems in Q2? This is where you should all be nodding yes, yes. And Andrew held up 2 fingers. That's like saying, are you saying peace? No, you're saying there's 2 problems. Okay, yeah, that's right. All right, cool. Yeah, there are 2 problems. So was it Abigail and Layla? Those the 2 individuals? So I know there's 2 individuals who were terminated and were not removed from the system. So is this a problem just in Q2? What did the case say that you had to do if you identified somebody who had not been removed from the system? You had to keep working through to see if they had gotten removed in Q3 or Q4. What happened to these two individuals? Were they removed from the system in Q3? They were not. Were they removed from the system in Q4? They were not. They're still in the system as far as we know today. Okay. 11 years later. Okay. 11 years later. So certainly problematic when we got somebody that's been let go and not removed from the system. So these are two recurring, and probably the biggest problem that we have is that they were not removed from the system and they're still in the system. All right. What about Q3? Is there a problem in Q3 terminated employees? Other than the two employees who were not removed in Q2, which, by the way, if you are tracking this on your spreadsheet, this would basically still be a problem because they had to be removed and they're still in the system. But if we ignore the fact that those two automatically make a problem, are there any other problems? No, not that I identified. What about the final quarter? What about the final quarter? Q4 terminated employees. Are there any problems here? Basically, all of the above are a problem. So it looks like now, did anybody kind of talk about this as the group about what was going on here? So there's a whole bunch of terminated employees, but what's unique about this list of terminated employees relative to the others? They all occurred on the same day. What does that signal to you all if they all occurred on the same day? Looks like that there was a mass layoff of the organization, okay? Now, when mass layoff occurs, just logically speaking, because you all have read enough business press and talked about this in other courses, what is likely to happen when the mass layoffs occur? Is everybody's gonna be like, you know what, that's just the breaks. I'm gonna find another job really quickly, and I bear no ill will to my company. They were good to me. Is that the way most people approach? Okay, that would be a gruntled employee. What is more likely happened? These are disgruntled employees. Actually, gruntled is not a word, which makes it funny because disgruntled is yeah. So I've never been gruntled in my life, but I've been disgruntled many times. Okay, so disgruntled employees. So what do we want to make sure happens when we have potentially disgruntled employees? That they get removed from the system immediately because they could reprise and have retribution against the organization. To our knowledge, they are still in the system 2.5 months later at the end of Q4. Now, just real quick, we know that there's a problem here. And by the way, your submission should look something like this with the explanations of these failures. Let's say that the organization say, we didn't realize we had that many problems. We need to figure out if there's any damages that occurred. What would be your next step? It's like, well, we did our work. We'll see you. We're going off to the next class. No, you've got 2 minutes. You've got to give me a solution in 2 minutes. Okay. So what would be the next step? We know that there are employees that have access to the system that should not have access to the system. What is the biggest concern about having employees having access to the system? They could record transactions that they should not be able to? Should we have external individuals who are not associated with the organization in any way anymore have access to the system? No. What is the danger of doing that? If they're authorized to access the system, they can still do things that they normally did back when they were working with the company. So the very first thing is I would go to look at what access they had within the system, like what areas of access, like sales, credit approvals, transaction areas, and I'd see, were there any transactions coordinated by these individuals that took place after their termination date? And then I want to investigate the breadth of that. So if I see a whole bunch of transactions that occurred after October 14th, 2020 or 2014 by this group of individuals right here, I'm gonna be like, okay, we've got a major problem. We've got a major problem and we have to fix that. If possible, invalidate the transactions. But if they were already transactions that can't be invalidated, like shipments or merchandise has been shipped or something along those lines, then we want to actually quantify the scope of the issue. That would be our next step in the way we need to think about a problem like that. All right. Quiz over the last 2 weeks on Friday, as well as our next Excel assignment. I'll see you all then.